In solidarity with Scholar Strike, I am going on strike to imagine with you a system that seeks to dismantle the racist structures that we are inhabiting. That Black lives are been and have been systematically targeted in the US, exists in continuity with the targeting of indigenous lives, of Maori and Pacifica lives here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So today what I will talk about is the ways in which the structure of whiteness works as a framework for silencing. So I've titled this brief presentation, Whiteness and Strategies of Silencing. I want to take a moment as we get started to thank the organizers of this strike, and I hope that this is a conversation that serves as a register for dismantling racism in the US, in settler colonies across the globe, and in majoritarian governments that systematically sponsor and target the killings of Black bodies, and in other contexts of bodies of minorities. So what I will do today is begin by talking about the concept of whiteness. Then I will discuss the nature of silencing as a framework for perpetuating whiteness, then work with you to imagine connections as the basis for dismantling white structures, and wrap up with some strategies. So when you look at the images of Black Lives Matter, and this is an image from the Black Lives Matter protests here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, one of the most powerful elements of these images is its ability to witness, to see and to voice whiteness and its infrastructures of violence. So I see Black Lives Matter as a register for imagining strategies for disrupting the silences that are perpetuated by whiteness. So let's begin by talking about whiteness and what it is. Whiteness is the perpetuation, establishment, circulation of cultural values that are embedded in white culture and that are precisely built up in order to uphold the supremacy of white people. So in that sense, whiteness is the fundamental infrastructure of white supremacy. White supremacy thrives on whiteness, on those coded values and cultural scripts that we take as normative, but that actually reflect the entrenched values of white culture, and that work to prop up and to place in positions of privilege white people. So in that sense, white culture as superior is a key element in that infrastructure of whiteness. Whiteness consistently works to put up white culture as superior, and it circulates this narrative of white culture as superior. And this sense of superiority then that is entrenched into whiteness is integral to the processes of colonization, to the occupation of the lands of indigenous peoples, to the imperial project, as well as to the project of slavery. Inherent in the narrative of whiteness is the notion of moving the beasts and the savages, which are the people from the colonized spaces and the people of Africa into the pathways of civilization, of course, through the reproduction of violence and strategies of violence. These forms of violence go all the way from rapes, murders, genocide, to incarceration and the prison industrial complex. So racism in that sense emerges from whiteness, from the sense of white superiority. But racism is also a political and economic project, because the devaluation of black lives, the devaluation of indigenous cultures, the devaluation of the cultures of colonized peoples, and the portrayal of these cultures as savages, as backward, as primitive, is fundamental to holding up whiteness and its superiority, and is fundamental to propelling its capitalist logics, to propelling its markets, and to propelling its use of labor as a site of exploitation. So the political economy of whiteness, therefore, depicts the ways in which the processes of colonization, slave trade are intertwined with holding up white capital. Capital, that way, is white in the sense that it holds up the nature of white culture and the supremacy of white people through both the erasure of black communities, through the erasure of indigenous communities, through the erasure of colonized communities, and through the ongoing devaluing of the cultures and the voices of the peoples of these communities. So whiteness as superiority actually works on an ongoing basis by marking blackness as primitive, by marking indigeneity as backward, by marking colonized people's cultures as savages. So whiteness perpetuates silence through a variety of strategies of communicative inversions, which is turning of materiality on its head through rhetorical devices. And one such communicative inversion is the notion of freedom. So whiteness puts forth the idea of freedom as one that emancipates black lives, as one that emancipates indigenous lives, precisely through the carrying out of violence on black lives and indigenous lives. So violence is justified because it is a civilizing tool. It produces the primitive other, and it does so through the languages of civility and through attacks on spaces of articulation. So the ongoing attacks of whiteness on Black Lives Matter, the ongoing attacks of whiteness on indigenous protests are tied to these strategies of silencing articulations that make visible the violence that is embedded in whiteness. So I will wrap up as we talk about these strategies of silencing by discussing how then do we dismantle these silencing strategies of whiteness. And I would suggest that we do so by seeing connections and by culturally centering these connections in struggles across spaces and across contexts. So by witnessing and seeing the violence that is perpetuated by whiteness on black lives in the US, by seeing the violence of whiteness on indigenous lives in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or in indigenous communities in the US, by seeing the violence perpetuated by the logics of whiteness in Palestine, by seeing the violence in refugee and migrant communities perpetuated by the logics of whiteness, we actually find registers for connecting. These registers for connecting break the silence by witnessing, by making visible and by seeing whiteness for what it is, an infrastructure of violence that perpetuates various logics of extraction through the colonization and incarceration of people. So I'm so glad that I have been able to join you on this brief conversation. Really enjoyed the various conversations that this moment has brought about, and this is to hoping that this is a register for bringing about transformations in racist white structures across the globe. Thank you.